where, for whatever reason, Christianity is the one religion that you're allowed to disparage.
Yeah.
Christianity is the one religion where people, all these progressive, open-minded, leftist people, they'll embrace all these different religions until it comes to Christianity.
When Mel Gibson and Joe Rogan start uncovering truths, nothing stands in their way. Not because Mel Gibson said anything shocking right away, and not because Joe Rogan suddenly turned it into some dramatic confrontation. It was quieter than that. Gibson was sitting there talking about the Passion of the Christ and the sequel he has been trying to build for years, and at first it sounded like a normal long-form interview. But the longer he spoke, the less it felt like a filmmaker revisiting an old success. It started to sound like someone returning to something unfinished, something that had cost him more than most people realized. And that is what makes this story interesting, because the Passion of the Christ was never just another film. It was not even treated like one. Long before audiences saw it, before critics argued over it, before churches filled theaters and news outlets turned it into a culture war, the film had already become something heavier behind the scenes. It had run into resistance, taken shape outside the normal studio system, and gathered the kind of stories around it that people still argue about years later. By the time Gibson was talking about it on Rogan's show, he was not just describing a production. He was describing a project that, in his view, had been opposed from the start and yet refused to disappear. That begins with what he was actually trying to make. From the beginning, Gibson did not want a comfortable biblical epic. He was not trying to give audiences a polished retelling they could admire from a distance and then forget on the drive home. He wanted the film to feel immediate, painfully immediate at times. The point was not just to show the last hours of Jesus as history, it was to make that suffering feel close enough that the viewer could not keep it safely in the past. In Gibson's telling, the sacrifice at the center of the story was never meant to belong only to another time. It was supposed to confront the present, and that is why he approached the material the way he did. He studied the Gospels closely, but he did not stop there. He also drew from older theological writings and religious interpretations, trying to build not only the events of the crucifixion, but the meaning surrounding them. He was not just interested in what happened, he was interested in what it meant, what it cost, and how to make that weight visible on screen. You can see that intent almost immediately in the film itself. The opening in Gethsemane does not play like spectacle, it plays like pressure. Jesus is alone in prayer while the people closest to him sleep nearby, and the scene is shaped less by action than by feeling. Darkness closes in. Fear is present. Even the symbolism is loaded, from the presence of Satan to the image of the serpent crushed underfoot. The point is not subtlety for its own sake, it is to signal right away that this story is being told as more than historical drama. It is being framed as spiritual conflict, human suffering, and divine purpose all at once. That kind of approach is part of why the film was difficult to get made. According to Gibson, the resistance started before cameras rolled. He described what he saw as a double standard in Hollywood, where many religious stories were treated carefully, but Christian stories, especially serious ones, were often met with skepticism or open dismissal. In that environment, the Passion of the Christ was seen not as bold, but as commercially hopeless, outdated, and potentially toxic. What followed was not one dramatic rejection, but a series of smaller signals that all pointed in the same direction. Meetings dried up. Interest faded. People who might once have backed the project stepped away. At that point, the film could have been softened, reshaped, or abandoned altogether. Instead, Gibson chose the hardest route. He financed it himself. That decision matters because it changed the meaning of the project. Once he did that, this was no longer just a controversial script moving through the studio system. It became a personal gamble. If it failed, it would fail on him. If it succeeded, it would do so without the support of the very industry that had assumed nobody wanted it. And then it succeeded on a scale almost no one expected. When The Passion of the Christ was released, it became one of the highest-grossing R-rated films ever made. That alone disrupted the narrative around it. A film many had treated as a commercial dead end reached millions of people and proved there was a huge audience for exactly the kind of story Hollywood had written off. But the success of the release is only part of why the film still carries this strange aura around it. The other part is what happened while it was being made. This is where the story becomes more difficult to place neatly because Gibson's account of the production moves beyond ordinary filmmaking problems and into the kind of territory that people either take very seriously or dismiss immediately. At the center of it is Jim Caviezel, who played Jesus. Caviezel's performance was shaped by real physical suffering. The cross he carried weighed heavily enough to injure him, and during one take, his shoulder was dislocated. During the scourging scenes, he was accidentally struck for real. The pain visible on screen was not entirely simulated, which helps explain why the performance feels so difficult to separate from the ordeal behind it. But the physical strain did not end there. Reports from the production included lightning strikes involving members of the crew, including the assistant director, and Caviezel himself was said to have been struck during filming of the crucifixion scene and survived without serious harm. In another context, these might sound like isolated incidents folded into production lore, but on this set they became part of a larger feeling among the people involved that the film was carrying an unusual charge. Whether one interprets that spiritually or not, it shaped the atmosphere around the production. There were quieter shifts too. Luca Lionello, who portrayed Judas, reportedly entered the film as an atheist and left with a changed outlook after spending months inside a story centered on betrayal, guilt, and redemption. Maya Morgenstern, who played Mary, was pregnant during filming, which gave her presence in the film an added emotional layer that people later read as symbolically striking given the themes of death, grief, and renewal surrounding the story. There were also accounts of unexpected healings and personal transformations around the set. These stories are not the kind that can be cleanly proven in the way a box office number can, but they mattered to the people who experienced them, and they became part of how the film was understood by those closest to it. That same intensity carried into the finished work. One of the clearest examples is the image of Jesus after the crucifixion, resting in Mary's arms in a composition that echoes Michelangelo's Pietà. The power of that moment does not depend on theology alone. It works because it condenses grief, tenderness, devastation, and dignity into one still image. It is the sort of scene that explains why even people who disagreed with the film often admitted it had real force. And disagreement came quickly. When the film reached theaters, it did not produce anything close to a neutral response. Some critics were deeply moved by it. Roger Ebert gave it a strong review and described it as one of the most intense cinematic experiences he had seen. Others respected its conviction even while questioning parts of its execution. But criticism was just as strong in other quarters. Some religious leaders and scholars worried that certain portrayals in the film risked reinforcing dangerous stereotypes with a long and violent history behind them. Those concerns were serious, and they shaped the public debate around the film before and after release. Gibson's answer was that his intention was not to single out one group but to show collective human responsibility. Even so, the debate never really resolved because the film was doing two things at once. It was functioning as art, with symbolism and interpretation layered into it, while also dealing with material so historically and religiously sensitive that every choice felt loaded. Different viewers brought different expectations, and the result was that almost nobody came away from it unaffected. That may be the most important part of the story. The Passion of the Christ did not become culturally significant because everyone agreed on it. It became significant because nobody could ignore it. Churches organized viewings. Religious leaders analyzed it publicly. Media outlets kept returning to it. People who had no normal interest in a film like this felt the need to watch it and decide for themselves where they stood. And even that, apparently, was not the end of Gibson's interest in the story. During the Rogan interview, he spoke about the resurrection project he has been developing with Randall Wallace for years. What he described was not a straightforward sequel, but something much more expansive. He wants to tell the story of the resurrection in a way that reaches beyond a single event and connects it to a much larger spiritual and historical frame, stretching from the fall of the angels to the end of the apostolic era. In other words, he is not trying to revisit the same ground, he is trying to widen it. That ambition reveals what was really coming through in the conversation. The interview was not powerful because of one dramatic revelation. It was powerful because, taken together, Gibson's account presented the Passion of the Christ as something more than a controversial hit. It became the story of a filmmaker who believed he was telling a necessary story, found himself blocked by the system that normally makes such films possible, pushed ahead anyway, and ended up creating a work that people still cannot comfortably sort into one category. For some, it is spiritual cinema at its most powerful. For others, it is deeply flawed and troubling. For many, it is somehow both. That is why the story stays alive, not because it is settled, but because it is not. Not because everyone sees the same thing in it, but because they do not. And maybe that is what gave that Rogan conversation its strange weight. It was not just a man revisiting an old movie. It was someone returning to a story that still feels unresolved, still provokes argument, and still carries